Sometimes revenge isn't loud. It doesn't explode like a movie scene or come wrapped in shouting matches and broken doors. Sometimes revenge is quiet. It waits, patiently, like a storm forming far beyond the horizon. And when it finally arrives, it doesn't just punish the guilty. It rewrites the entire balance of power. This is the story of someone who was pushed too far. Someone underestimated. Someone told to stay silent, stay small, stay in their corner. Until one day, they didn't. One day they stood up, not with fists, not with screams, but with something far more terrifying. Clarity, strategy, and absolute determination. Because the most devastating justice doesn't come from anger. It comes from finally deciding, enough. And once that decision is made, nothing is ever the same again. For the longest time, life moved quietly, almost politely, as if it didn't dare disturb the surface of routine. People walked around pretending everything was fine, pretending the insults didn't sting, pretending that dismissive gestures were just bad moods or stress talking. But silence has a strange way of collecting weight. It settles in layers like dust on shelves no one bothers to clean anymore. Day after day, the quiet was filled with small humiliations, subtle dismissals, and the slow erosion of dignity. The world outside may have seen stability, warmth, even family. But behind closed doors, there was a different story playing out. A story where respect wasn't given, kindness was taken for weakness, and someone who deserved love was treated like an inconvenience. And isn't it strange how people assume the quiet one has no breaking point? How they believe that just because someone keeps swallowing pain, it means they'll keep doing it forever? Silence doesn't break suddenly. It cracks first. It whispers. It begins with a moment when the heart no longer absorbs the blow the same way. A moment when the eyes no longer glaze over to avoid feeling. A moment when something inside finally says, "This isn't right." And for the first time, the thought doesn't go away. Instead, it lingers. It sits in the chest, in the throat, in every breath. It starts turning that quiet ache into awareness. Every disrespectful word rings louder. Every careless act feels sharper. Every reminder of how far things have drifted from what they should have been digs deeper. And you can almost feel the shift, can't you? That silent emotional pivot where pain quietly transforms into clarity. Where the person who once tolerated everything begins to truly see what's happening. Not as family drama, not as a rough patch, but as injustice. Something that was never okay, even when they pretended it was. Meanwhile, the ones causing the hurt continue on with confidence, because arrogance feeds on the idea that consequences don't exist. They sit comfortably in their illusion of control, convinced nothing will ever change, convinced that the person standing in the shadows will always stay small. They laugh louder, push harder, claim more space, more authority, more power that was never really theirs. And all the while, life records every moment, every insult, every humiliation, every memory where someone deserving respect was told to shrink a little more. It's strange how the world works. The very moments meant to break someone often become the exact moments that build their strength. Have you ever noticed that? The deeper the wound, the sharper the awareness that grows from it. And eventually, the silence that once meant defeat begins to mean something entirely different. Preparation. Because then comes the real turning point. Not the loud explosion people expect, but something quieter, steadier, more decisive. One day, instead of tears, there is focus. Instead of confusion, there is certainty. Instead of desperation, there is resolve. And when that happens, the entire atmosphere changes. The room feels different. The air feels different. Even the heartbeat feels different. It's not rage, not chaos, but a calm strength that says, enough. No dramatic speeches, no warning shot, just a final inner decision that the story will not continue the same way. And that's when silence stops being a prison and becomes power. That's when the first invisible line is drawn. And although no one else recognizes it yet, everything has already begun to change. The quiet person is no longer shrinking, waiting, enduring. They are standing up, slowly, thoughtfully, and the world has no idea what's coming next. There's always that one moment people remember for the rest of their lives, the precise second when everything changes. It rarely arrives dramatically. It doesn't always come with screaming thunder or shattered glass. Sometimes it's subtle. A sentence uttered with too much arrogance. A laugh that cuts deeper than a knife. A gesture that finally strips away the last layer of tolerance. That moment came quietly, almost deceptively, wrapped in ordinary routine. The day looked like every other day on the outside. But on the inside, something was already shifting. The room was the same. The voices were the same. The rhythm of life unchanged. And yet, beneath the surface, patience had reached its final thread. You know that feeling, don't you? When you're physically present but emotionally done. When the soul simply refuses to absorb one more ounce of disrespect. It happened fast and slow at the same time. The way life does, in moments that matter. Words were said, harsh, entitled, dismissive. Not as a joke, not in a passing mood, but as a declaration of superiority, as if someone believed they truly owned not just the space, but the person in it. That tone, that confidence, that unapologetic certainty that they could belittle someone and get away with it. Again. And something inside finally shattered, not loudly, not violently, but with a clarity so sharp it almost felt like glass breaking inside the chest. In that split second, there was no more denial to hide behind, no more excuses to soften the reality, no more illusions of, maybe it'll get better. Instead, there was truth, cold, undeniable truth. Staring straight back like a reflection nobody could avoid anymore. Time slows down when something inside you snaps like that. The world keeps moving. People keep talking. But there's a silence inside that feels louder than anything around. Every memory of kindness taken for granted suddenly resurfaces. Every favor, every sacrifice, every moment of loyalty throws itself into focus. And you realize something heartbreaking. You were never respected the way you deserved. That hurts. It burns in a way only betrayal can. But it also sparks something powerful. Courage. Steady, unwavering courage. And courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply whispers, no more. That whisper is far more dangerous than any scream. That whisper is the birth of change. Because the moment someone stops pleading for respect and decides to claim it, everything shifts. And that was the moment power changed hands, even if nobody realized it yet. The one who was once overlooked didn't crumble. They became still, calm, composed, focused. And that composure is terrifying to those who built their strength on domination. No tantrum, no desperate tears. Just silence. The kind of silence that signals the end of tolerance and the beginning of consequence. That's when the story stops being about suffering and starts becoming about justice. The people who thought they owned the narrative had no idea their time was running out. Because from that moment forward, everything they had taken for granted was now at risk. They just didn't know it yet. But life did, and life had already switched sides. Pain has an interesting personality. At first, it feels wild, chaotic, unbearable, like a storm that just wants to tear everything apart. But when it lingers long enough, it changes shape. It stops screaming and starts thinking. That's what happened next. The wounds that once caused only tears began to sharpen into awareness. Every memory of humiliation didn't hurt the same way anymore. Instead, it turned into information. Every disrespectful moment became a reminder of who could and could not be trusted. And this is where real transformation begins, isn't it? Not when someone is angry, but when they are finally clear. Pain stopped being something to survive and started becoming something to use. Not in a cruel way, not in a reckless way, but in a strategic, deeply intentional way. Because here's a truth many people don't realize. Nobody becomes powerful by accident. It happens because they finally stop playing the role they were assigned, the one they were expected to quietly accept. For so long the hurt had been swallowed, softened, disguised as patience or love. But once the illusion faded, reality felt sharper, cleaner, more honest. There was no more pretending that things will change on their own. No more waiting for apologies that would never come. No more believing in promises that were only made to keep control. Instead, there was a new kind of thinking. Thoughtful, steady, deliberate. The same heart that once broke now beat with purpose. Not revenge for revenge's sake, but justice. The kind that restores balance rather than simply seeks to hurt back. Slowly, the mind began to work differently. Instead of reacting emotionally, it started planning logically. Instead of reliving pain, it began organizing it, like files in a cabinet. Categorized, remembered, ready. Every moment of mistreatment became a lesson. Every boundary that had once been crossed now became a line carved deeply in stone. There was finally space to breathe, to look at the situation honestly, to ask important questions. Who benefits from your silence? Who grows stronger each time you shrink? And most importantly, how long will you allow it? Those aren't questions you ask when you're broken. Those are questions you ask when you're waking up. And once a heart wakes up, it rarely ever falls asleep again. That's where real strength lives, in clarity. And so the wounds transformed. They didn't disappear. They evolved. They stopped being marks of weakness and became marks of survival, proof that someone endured and still chose not to turn cruel, but wise. The pain didn't produce bitterness. It produced discipline, self-control, strategy. A quiet decision took root. The story would not end in defeat. It would not end with humiliation. It would not end with someone else claiming power over a life they never valued. Instead, it would lead to a reckoning, not driven by rage, but by justice. The foundation of the plan was forming, calm, focused, unstoppable. And for the first time in a long time, the future didn't feel like something to fear. It felt like something to prepare for. There comes a moment when clarity finally matures into intent. Not a rash impulse, not a burst of rebellious energy, but a deliberate shift in direction. That's when everything becomes quieter, strangely calmer. Planning doesn't come from anger. It comes from understanding exactly what has been taken and what must be restored. So instead of pacing rooms, crying into pillows, or replaying arguments in an endless loop, there was now a different rhythm. Measured breaths, steadier thoughts, sharper awareness. The world suddenly looked different. Every problem wasn't chaos anymore. It was a puzzle. Every injustice wasn't just pain. It was evidence. And like a careful architect, piece by piece, thought by thought, the blueprint for justice began to form. A plan not born from spite, but from dignity. This is where discipline replaces emotion, where patience becomes a weapon in itself. No more giving warnings to people who never listened. No more trying to fix what was never broken on your side to begin with. Instead, there was observation, quiet, unnoticed, dangerous in its silence. Old conversations resurfaced, not to relive them, but to analyze them. Patterns appeared. Power dynamics became obvious. Who held influence? Who depended on whom financially? Whose confidence was just bravado hiding fear? The truth is, people who hurt others rarely believe they can be challenged. They build their arrogance on the assumption that the person they target will never fight back. So they become predictable, sloppy, exposed. And predictability is the greatest gift you can receive when you're planning justice. Plans like this aren't just about what to do. They're about who to become while doing it. And so, there was preparation on every level, emotionally to ensure decisions were guided by intelligence rather than rage, mentally to stay focused even when doubt tried to creep in, practically to gather whatever strength, proof, or support might be needed along the way. The act of planning itself becomes empowering. It restores something that had been slowly taken. Control. Control over the future, over choices, over the narrative that had once belonged entirely to someone else. It felt like reclaiming oxygen after years of breathing through a narrow straw. More than anything, it proved one irrefutable truth. The person who was once treated as powerless was anything but. So the structure of justice solidified. No rushing, no noise, just precision. Because real revenge, the kind rooted in justice, isn't chaotic destruction. It's balance. It's making sure consequences finally meet actions. It's ensuring that those who thrived on dominance finally experience accountability. And most importantly, it's about rebuilding a life that is no longer dictated by someone else's ego. That realization didn't spark recklessness. It sparked strength. Cold, steady, unwavering strength. A silent promise echoed within. This ends differently now. And with that promise, the stage was set. The storm wasn't coming in fury. It was coming with purpose. And the people who once believed they were untouchable were about to find out how wrong they truly were. The first strike is never the loudest. It doesn't announce itself with chaos or drama. It arrives quietly, almost politely, like an unexpected knock on a door at a very inconvenient time. That's what makes it so powerful. The people who once felt invincible rarely see it coming, because they're too used to winning without effort, too accustomed to others bending instead of resisting. So, when the first consequence finally arrives, it doesn't look like revenge. It looks like reality finally waking up. A reality they never imagined would turn against them. And it always begins with something small. A shift in tone. A refusal where there was once obedience. A boundary drawn where there was once surrender. Simple, but devastating. Because the strongest first move isn't meant to destroy. It's meant to shake. That first moment of resistance has weight. You can feel it in the air. The balance changes, even if no one can quite explain why. Suddenly, the person who once stayed silent doesn't react the same way anymore. Their eyes aren't pleading. They're steady. Their voice isn't apologetic, it's firm. They stop explaining themselves to people who never listened. They stop giving chances to those who wasted them. And that shift unsettles the ones who benefited from their compliance. Confusion creeps in. Annoyance follows. Then fear, though they won't admit it. Because deep down they recognize something dangerous. The control they enjoyed isn't guaranteed anymore. The first strike doesn't hurt because it's destructive. It hurts because it proves they no longer own the narrative. That's when panic begins to flicker. They question. They demand. They accuse. What changed? Why are you acting different? What's gotten into you? As if the problem suddenly appeared out of thin air, rather than being built by years of their own actions. They try the same tactics that used to work. Manipulation, guilt, shouting, charm. Whatever they relied on to maintain power. But it doesn't land the same anymore. Their words bounce back like dull echoes in an empty hall. They realize something terrifying. The emotional buttons they used to press no longer function. The person in front of them is no longer controlled by fear or obligation or love twisted into chains. And for someone who thrives on dominance, nothing is more unsettling than losing influence over the very person they took for granted. And so the first strike hits in silence, but its impact is thunderous, not because it destroys, but because it reveals. It exposes weakness in the so-called powerful. It shows just how fragile their confidence truly was, how dependent their strength had always been on someone else's submission. And for the one delivering that first silent blow, something incredible happens too. Strength doesn't just return, it expands. The heart feels lighter, the mind feels clearer, the future feels less frightening. This isn't about revenge anymore. It's about reclaiming dignity. And with that first move made, there is no going back. The game has changed, and this time, it won't be played on their terms. Consequences never arrive with the same arrogance as the actions that caused them. They don't swagger in loudly the way disrespect once did. They don't come wrapped in pride or bravado. Instead, they move with calm certainty, like a slow but unstoppable tide. And when that tide finally begins to rise, those who once felt untouchable are the first to panic. It starts subtly. Little disruptions appear in the lives of those who believed they controlled everything. Doors that once opened easily now resist. Conversations they once dominated suddenly turn tense. Their confidence begins to crack. At first, they laugh it off because powerful people don't admit fear. They disguise it as annoyance, mockery, irritation. But beneath that surface, there's a tremor. Because deep down, they sense it. The world is no longer bending for them. Then the ripple becomes a wave. The comfort they were so used to begins to collapse in slow, painful pieces. The support they took for granted disappears. The resources they abused slip out of reach. The person they once manipulated no longer plays along, no longer reacts, no longer dances to their chaos. That's when anger usually erupts. They stomp louder. They shout harder. They push more aggressively. Because control slipping through their fingers feels unbearable. But anger doesn't fix anything now. If anything, it exposes them further. The more they rage, the clearer their desperation becomes. Their power wasn't strength after all. It was borrowed authority, built on someone else's sacrifice. And now that sacrifice has ended. What makes this stage truly poetic is how reality becomes the very judge they mocked. People who once believed their lies begin to question them. Those who once admired them now see the fractures. Their image, once polished and intimidating, starts to look pitiful. They're no longer the confident figure towering over others. They're the person scrambling to keep their ego intact. And the funniest thing? They still try to pretend it's not happening. They blame everything and everyone except themselves. They point fingers outward instead of looking inward, because accountability has always been their greatest fear. But life has patience. It lets them struggle. It makes them face their reflection, and slowly, but surely, it forces them to understand. Every action carries a price. Meanwhile, for the one who was once hurt, this is not a moment of cruelty. It's a moment of confirmation. Not celebration of someone else's downfall, but relief that justice is finally moving. The heart doesn't feel vicious. It feels steady, strong, vindicated. There's no desire to humiliate, no need to scream, no hunger for chaos. Just a deep, quiet satisfaction in knowing that what was once endured in silence is now being answered with consequence. And this is only the beginning, because once the first cracks appear in a false empire, it never stops collapsing. There comes a point when lies can no longer hold their shape. They wobble first, like a poorly built tower swaying in the wind, and then, piece by piece, they begin to crumble. That's exactly what started happening now. Everything that had once been carefully crafted to appear powerful and dominant began revealing its true nature. Fragile, hollow, dependent on deception. Promises that once sounded confident now felt empty. Stories that once convinced everyone now fell apart under the slightest pressure. And the person who had built their identity on intimidation suddenly stood exposed beneath a spotlight they could no longer escape. That's the thing about lies. They may let you stand tall for a while, but they will never let you stand forever. Soon the collapse stopped being invisible. It became loud. People noticed. Friends turned distant. Supporters turned skeptical. The respect that had once seemed unshakable vanished almost overnight. Every reckless decision they'd made, every cruel word they'd spoken, every selfish choice they'd justified, it all returned like echoes in a canyon, louder and louder until they could no longer pretend not to hear. Reputation fell first, then confidence, then control. They weren't feared anymore. They were pitied. And if there's anything more devastating than losing power, it's realizing the power you thought you had was never real to begin with. It only existed because others allowed it. For the one who had endured all that pain, this wasn't about revenge anymore. This was truth, cleansing everything it touched. Watching the empire of lies collapse didn't feel like triumph in a dramatic movie scene. It felt like breathing clean air after years in smoke. It was clarity. It was relief. It was freedom. And with each collapsed lie, a weight lifted off their shoulders. They didn't need to shout, didn't need to boast, didn't need to taunt the fallen. Their silence spoke louder than any victory speech ever could. Because justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply stands tall and lets reality finish what it started. And what remained after the collapse was telling. The one who had once ruled through fear now stood alone, surrounded by the ruins of their own choices. No loyalty, no admiration, no authority left to cling to. Just consequences, raw and unavoidable. Meanwhile, the person they once tried to break stood stronger than ever. Not because they destroyed someone else, but because they refused to be destroyed themselves. The tables hadn't just turned. The entire landscape had changed. The empire built on lies was gone. And in its place, truth finally stood without trembling. There always comes a moment when running is no longer an option. No more hiding behind excuses. No more ducking behind ego. No more pretending to be untouchable. Eventually, life leads both sides to the same place, a face-to-face reckoning. And when that moment arrived, the atmosphere shifted like a storm pressing against a closed window. You could almost feel the weight in the air. No shouting, no chaos. Just two worlds finally standing across from each other. The one who once held power, and the one who refused to bow anymore. Their eyes met, not as victim and oppressor, but as equals. At least for a moment. Except they weren't equals now. Not really. Because one of them had truth, steadiness, and control. The other had fear disguised as anger. They tried to speak first, of course. People like that always do. They hide behind loud voices, dramatic gestures, accusations, even sudden bursts of charm. They scrambled for control like someone reaching for a rope slipping through their fingers. Excuses spilled out, half apologies wrapped in blame appeared. You misunderstood. You're overreacting. You think you're strong now? And beneath every word was the same desperate plea. Give me back the power I lost. But it didn't work anymore. The authority in their tone had vanished. Their voice might have been loud, but it was empty. And nothing is louder than emptiness in a confrontation. Because when a person has finally found their strength, they don't argue. They don't explain. They simply stand their ground. And that is far more unsettling than any shouted threat. Meanwhile, the once silent heart didn't tremble, didn't shrink, didn't soften into guilt. Instead, it spoke with clarity. Calm words, precise truths, boundaries that were no longer negotiable. It wasn't about revenge now. It was about dignity. Every sentence carried years of swallowed pain finally coming out in a steady, measured voice. No dramatics, no emotional collapse, just reality, delivered firmly. And the more truth was spoken, the smaller the so-called powerful figure began to look. It became painfully clear who truly had strength, not the one raising their voice, but the one who didn't need to, not the one demanding control, but the one who no longer depended on their approval. That is the moment when true power reveals itself, not in dominance, but in self-possession. By the end of that confrontation, the room felt lighter. A balance that had been twisted for so long finally corrected itself. They stood there, not as conqueror and conquered, but as two people facing consequences, one accepting them, the other still fighting a losing battle against them. And as the final words settled into silence, something important happened. Fear didn't walk away with the one who once suffered. It stayed with the one who caused the suffering. Because they finally understood. Control was gone. Respect was gone. And there was nothing left to manipulate. Justice didn't need permission anymore. It was already in motion. And the person who once stood powerless walked away, not angry, not shaken, but free. Justice doesn't always come wrapped in fire and chaos. Sometimes it settles like a calm sunrise after a restless night. Slow, steady, undeniable. That's what the final act felt like. Not a dramatic explosion, not a vengeful spectacle, but a quiet conclusion that carried more weight than any scream could. The final justice wasn't about proving power or inflicting pain. It was about closure, about restoring balance to a life that had once been twisted under someone else's arrogance. When the final moment arrived, there was no shaking voice, no trembling hands, just certainty. The scales that had been tilted unfairly for so long finally leveled, and everything fell exactly where it belonged. For the one who once caused so much harm, this was the moment reality finally refused to negotiate. No more excuses, no more manipulation, no more second chances dressed up as apologies. Consequences stood in front of them like a mirror they couldn't look away from. Their confidence, once towering and suffocating, was gone. In its place stood someone smaller, someone stripped of entitlement, someone who finally had to acknowledge the truth. They had built their world on dominance, and that world no longer existed. If they spoke now, their voice carried none of the authority it once did. It carried regret, maybe even fear. Not because someone was punishing them violently, but because life itself had finally stopped cushioning their behavior. Meanwhile, for the one who endured it all, this was not just a victory. It was liberation. The heart felt lighter, not with triumph, but with relief. Breathing didn't hurt anymore. Existing didn't feel like a battlefield. They weren't haunted by old conversations or replaying past humiliations in their mind. Instead, there was a sense of peace, the kind that only arrives when someone refuses to live beneath another person's shadow ever again. It wasn't about seeing someone else fall. It was about finally standing fully upright. It was about walking forward without chains disguised as love, family, or loyalty. This justice didn't scar the soul. It healed it. And when everything finally settled, there was no need for applause, no need for revenge-soaked satisfaction. Just a quiet acknowledgement. The story had changed. The person who once seemed broken stood stronger than ever, not because they destroyed their enemy, but because they refused to be destroyed anymore. The final justice wasn't loud. It wasn't cruel. It was simply fair. And that is always the most powerful ending of all. The chapter of pain had closed. A new chapter, one built on independence, self-respect, and unshakable inner strength, had just begun. Peace doesn't arrive with trumpets. It doesn't burst through the door demanding attention. It slips in quietly, like sunlight creeping through curtains in the morning. After the storm, life didn't suddenly become perfect. There were still memories, still echoes of old pain, still moments where the heart would unexpectedly remember everything it had endured. But something fundamental had changed. The air felt clearer. The weight that once lived in the chest had lifted. The silence that used to feel suffocating now felt comforting. It was no longer the silence of suppression. It was the silence of freedom. The world didn't feel hostile anymore. It felt open, like possibilities were unfolding one breath at a time. For the first time in a very long time, life wasn't about surviving. It was about living. Little things suddenly meant everything. The simple act of waking up without dread, making choices without fear of consequences, engineered by someone else, laughing without guilt, being able to sit in a room and feel safe. Not because the space changed, but because the energy within it finally belonged to the right person. That's the beauty of peace. It's rarely loud, but it transforms everything it touches. Days began to feel lighter. Sleep came easier. The mirror no longer reflected someone tired of enduring. It reflected someone who had fought a quiet war, and won not by destroying another person, but by reclaiming themselves. And that victory stays in the bones. It strengthens the spine. It softens the heart without weakening it. It teaches you that strength and gentleness can coexist. There were lessons, too, deep, permanent ones. Lessons about boundaries, about truth, about never allowing kindness to be mistaken for submission, about how dangerous it is to shrink yourself so someone else can feel big. That period of darkness had carved wisdom into the soul. It taught that love without respect is a prison, loyalty without reciprocity is self-betrayal, and silence in the face of injustice isn't patience. It's slow self-erasure. But most importantly, it proved something powerful. Even the quietest person can change the entire direction of their life the moment they refuse to be treated like they don't matter. That realization wasn't bitter. It wasn't vengeful. It was grounding. It became a promise, whispered gently to oneself. Never again. And so life continued. Not with fear, but with confidence. Not with anger, but with calm strength. The past didn't disappear, but it no longer controlled the present. It existed only as a reminder of how far strength can grow when someone refuses to surrender their dignity. Peace after the storm isn't about forgetting what happened. It's about finally being able to breathe without pain. It's about sitting with your own company and knowing you're safe there. It's about understanding that justice isn't always about punishment, Sometimes it's simply about walking away with your head held high and your future completely your own. And in that quiet, steady peace, there is a different kind of power. A power that doesn't need to prove itself. A power that simply is.